Hi students, welcome to lesson 7 on the US's involvement in World War I, or as like to call this lesson, the Great War Over There, as Americans referred to Europe. And so to start off, imagine that I asked you to name every country on this map and explain why most of them have been at war with one another at some point over the last 100 years. First of all, can anyone figure out where in the world this even is? If you look at this country, it might give you a clue. It's somewhat more recognizable. It's actually Italy right here. Then you've got Greece, Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and so on. But a lot of your gut reaction would probably be, no thanks, I'll pass. I have better things to do with my time, right? If so, then you share something in common with most Americans 100 years ago during World War I. For the first 3 years of World War I, most Americans couldn't be bothered to care too much about who was fighting whom or why. Even after America entered the war, most Americans simply referred to the whole mess nebulously as the war over there, as this song kind of referred to, which you can, I encourage you to look at that in your free time. This is one of the popular patriotic songs during America's participation in World War I. It's called Over There. In fact, if you also watch this following 11-minute crash course on World War I video, you'll probably have a better grasp than most Americans did of the European politics that led up to the war. So I'm not really going to go too much into the context of all the various rivalries in Europe, but if you're interested in that, I very much encourage you to look at this video. It also comes with closed captioning, by the way. But in any case, there were some Americans that viewed the war with mild curiosity, sort of like a sports match between two teams that you don't normally follow very closely, but you see, I wonder who's going to win. And a small portion of Americans did have strong sympathies for one side or the other. Yet, for the first 3 years of the war, few Americans were eager to die to help either side to victory. And as a side note, by the way, 20 years after World War I, Americans would have a very different feeling about, for example, the Spanish Civil War, which persuaded thousands of Americans, or in fact, it might have even been tens of thousands of Americans, to volunteer to fight mainly on the anti-fascist side of the Spanish Civil War, despite the fact that the American government was officially neutral towards the Spanish Civil War for the entire time. And in fact, the American government tried to prohibit American volunteers from traveling into the Spanish to fight in the Spanish Civil War. The U.S. government was afraid that this would get us entangled, that it would reflect badly on, that it would look like that the government was trying to get, volunteers sent over. So it actually tried to keep Americans from going over there, but Americans snuck out anyways. We were very passionately passionately in favor of fighting on the anti-fascist side there. So that's one that attracted quite a bit more enthusiasm from Americans at first. At first, when it came to World War I, very few Americans were as passionate as that, one way or the other, for either side's cause in World War I. And if you want to compare, for example, with how passionate even the modern debate is in Britain over whether Britain should have fought in World War I, you see there's a very lively debate here. It's about an hour and 40 minutes long, so this is not required to watch, but it is interesting if you're curious to look further into this. I found it entertaining myself. President Woodrow Wilson, in fact, won re-election to the presidency in 1916, 2 years into World War I, on a slogan of "He kept us out of the war." And then, funny enough, just a few months into his next term in office, a few months later, Woodrow Wilson suddenly decided to ask Congress to declare war on Germany and get involved in the war. And Congress, and most American citizens, responded yes with gusto. So that's a bit strange, huh? How things can flip so quickly from vote for Wilson because he kept us out of the war and we don't want to get involved in this war, to let's get involved in the war, right? So the two questions we have to, ask are, why were Americans so uninspired at first about getting involved in this war? And why did the Allied cause suddenly become so much more inspiring to so many Americans in early 1917, 3 years into the war? What changed? What were the turning points? All right. So first, let's look at why was it so uninspiring at first. And one reason was it kind of looked like the war was one big petty family feud between a bunch of closely related European monarchs. As if the war were some particularly heated chess match between cousins in which the opposing monarchs used millions of their subjects as literal pawns to fight each other for their own personal glorification. And it was easy to get this impression of the war because, in fact, the major monarchs were closely related to each other, mainly through marriage, as this family tree kind of shows. But in fact, most of the monarchs who were involved here actually kind of regretted having to fight their relatives. It wasn't really solely a war motivated for their personal glorification. I think that's a common misconception. More importantly, it was a war to enlarge each country's empire. These monarchs were under intense pressure from economic and military elites, as well as from ordinary citizens in their countries, to enhance the prosperity, security, and glory of their empires at the expense of rival empires. The groundswell of nationalism at the start of the war in all of the countries involved was impossible for even an absolute monarch like Tsar Nicholas II of Russia to ignore. Plus, most of the countries involved were not absolute monarchies, but constitutional monarchies, more or less similar to Great Britain, with its mostly symbolic monarch overseeing an elected parliament. So, these constitutional monarchs could not just ignore what their citizens wanted. And at the beginning of the war, their citizens wanted war. So, what are you going to do? For example, Germany had an elected parliament called the Reichstag. It is true that the German Kaiser was less purely symbolic than the British king, and had more actual power, and that the elected German Reichstag had a bit less sway over its own government than the elected House of Commons had for Britain's government. The House of Commons was the British equivalent of the German Reichstag. Britain was certainly a bit more democratic than Germany, and France, a full republic without a monarch, was arguably even more democratic. But I think we must keep in mind that we are talking about degrees of variation on a spectrum. It's not as if the German government was uniquely oppressive. If any government deserved that award, it was the Russian government, which had earned the nickname the Prison of Nations, thanks to how the Russian Tsar collected and undemocratically exploited dozens of ethnicities in his vast absolutist empire. Not that the other empires looked much better by comparison, especially when you looked at the overseas colonies and how they were governed. Around this same time, Britain was busy gunning down Irish separatists and demonstrators in India who were peacefully calling for independence. France was busy putting down rebellions in Vietnam, or as it was called at the time, Indochina. Germany was busy gunning down the Herero people in Africa and placing some of the captured insurgents there in concentration camps. Belgium was well on its way to killing about 10 million Africans in its colony of the Congo, largely by overworking the native Africans on rubber plantations there and severely punishing them by, for example, chopping off their hands and inflicting other cruelties in cases where they were disobedient. I mean, the list could go on. No empire was a beacon of pure liberty and freedom, you might say. And even if many Europeans popularly supported the war as a fight to enlarge each of their own empires, the idea of Americans dying to enlarge someone else's empire, with all of their immoralities, and brutalities was not enticing to Americans. And it's not as if the European empires were eager to shave off some chunks of their empires to give to America as a bribe if America should join one side or the other. For example, that was basically the offer given to Italy to get Italy to break its earlier promise to side with Germany and Austria-Hungary and instead to come over to the side of Britain and France. Italy was promised all these provinces that it would get at the expense of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which, by the way, Italy did not end up getting everything it was promised, and there was a lot of bitterness there that led to the rise of Mussolini and the fascists in Italy after World War I, in the sense that we need revenge because we did not get what we were promised. We demand expansion of our Italian empire. That's largely where that comes from after World War I. But they weren't. European countries were not really making this sort of offer to America that, hey, we'll give you some of the spoils if you join. And partly it's because America still at this time had a relatively unproven army. Sure, the new all-steel American Navy destroyed the decrepit, mostly wooden Spanish Navy in the Spanish-American War, but Spain was not a modern adversary. What use was America against a modern adversary like Germany? People weren't sure, if America was really up to it. What price was it worth to offer in America to become an ally? And would Americans even respond to a bold, unashamed bribe of imperial plunder in exchange for entry into the war, as Italy did? And, at the time, in fact, William Jennings Bryan was the Secretary of State in Woodrow Wilson's administration. So William Jennings Bryan was in charge of diplomacy at the beginning of World War I. And he was a well-renowned anti-imperialist, non-interventionist, pacifist. So he was not eager to get involved in the war, even if it had meant America got a little bit of a bribe. He just wasn't interested. So as things stood, there really was nothing, it seemed like, to gain for America to get involved in the war at first. So Europe left America alone, America left Europe alone, and they did their own things, except when it came to trade. And here, America became entangled with Europe. This is one of the big reasons why America would end up desiring to join the war on the side of Britain and France. All right, is because America became a huge creditor to those countries and wanted to make sure that Britain and France won the war so they could pay back their loans to America. Before the war, America was already the world's biggest economy in terms of industrial output, but World War I only intensified this trend and also catapulted America into the position of the world's biggest creditor, and actually did the opposite for Britain, by the way. Britain had been the world's biggest creditor, became the world's biggest debtor after World War I. So World War I is really where America and Britain finally switched places for good. Where before the war, Britain, you could still make an argument, was number one. Maybe not in terms of industrial output, but when you factor in everything together, financial strength, geographic, this was the time when the sun never set on the British Empire. It had holdings all around the world. Britain loaned money all around the world. It was the biggest creditor nation. So here in World War I is where Britain and America really switch, and America becomes the superpower in the world. But this came with a catch, basically. With all the countries in Europe so short on cash, they bought a lot of things from America on credit. All right. So like I said, America became this creditor nation. But the catch there is you need to make sure that these countries can pay you back. All right. You need to make sure that their economies are going to be in good shape after the war. And as the war went on, American businesses became disproportionately attached to hopes of a British and French victory. And the reason is, as much as American businesses would have liked to sell to both sides in the war, Britain's immense surface navy, its battleships and so on, and its complete naval blockade of Germany made it all but impossible to trade with Germany. In fact, American merchant ships didn't even try to run the blockade, being certain that they would be spotted and turned back at gunpoint by the immense British Navy. On the other hand, American businesses continued to trade with Britain and France. Germany attempted its own blockade of these countries, but Germany had a much larger area to patrol and had to rely on lightly armed submarines for its blockade. So American merchant ships were tempted to try to run this blockade, knowing that most of their ships would get through, and only the occasional unfortunate American ship would be sunk. And by the way, because Germany was using submarines, they couldn't just politely stop and ask American ships to turn back, even if they did spot American merchant ships trying to run the blockade. Um, the German submarines, in order to make the blockade effective, had to fire, without first being detected. Because once you're detected, even a lightly armed merchant ship could destroy a submarine. So submarines relied on the element of surprise. So this made Germany look particularly barbaric, that it had to fire on ships first without warning in order to make its blockade effective. By early 1917, American companies were owed over $2.25 billion from Britain, France, and other Allied powers, but only $27 million from Germany. They weren't able to trade with Germany. So much more money was at risk of never being repaid to American businesses if the British and French were to lose the war, especially if the British and French governments had to pay crippling reparations to a victorious German government, just like in reality, where Germany ended up having to pay crippling reparations to the victorious British and French governments. Americans began to fear that their prosperity would be threatened if Germany were allowed to win the war. And you could say also, America might have avoided its ships being targeted by German submarines entirely if American merchant ships had kept out of this war zone, but that would defeat the whole purpose of, selling to both sides, and, that would have cut a very lucrative opportunity for American businesses to profit from this war. And they said, no, we're not going to give that up. We're not going to make that sort of compromise with the German government. We think we can run this blockade, and even if we don't, we're going to have a feeling of outrage when we are fired upon, which, I don't know, I've always just found it strange that the same sort of outrage is not applied to the British blockade of Germany. Why not complain to Britain about their blockade and the fact that American businesses couldn't sell to Germany? Isn't that an outrage, a crime against humanity and international law? It's a bit of a double standard, in my opinion, when it comes to how Americans reacted to this war, but we'll get to that. That's something you can discuss in your discussion forums for this week. Another factor is the revolution in Russia that broke out in early 1917. This is another turning point that suddenly changes Americans' minds from being kind of aloof to the war to suddenly being very invested in it. As long as Russia kept the Central Powers, meaning Germany and Austria-Hungary, tied up on the Eastern Front, many Americans were optimistic that Britain and France could win even without America's help. But after Russia had its first revolution in 1917, Americans began to doubt that Britain and France could defeat Germany without America's help. Even though the new provisional Russian government kept Russia formally in the war, Russian soldiers began to routinely disobey orders from the new government to go on the offensive, and Germany was able to shuffle some of its soldiers from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, confident that Russia would not be able to seriously threaten Germany after this point. Germany was right. The Russian soldiers were done fighting by this point. Even though their government was technically still at war with Germany, Russian soldiers were done. They were not going to obey orders to... there was one last offensive in 1917, the so-called Kerensky offensive, but it quickly ran out of steam as the soldiers stopped marching forward and decided we've had enough. And that's one of the reasons why there's actually a second revolution in Russia in 1917, the so-called October Revolution or Bolshevik Revolution, where the communists then take power in Russia on a platform of that we're going to bring peace, land, and bread. We're going to bring an end to this war, which was extremely popular. And that's largely what helps them come to power and win the support of the soldiers in Russia. Um, Another factor is this Zimmermann telegram. When Germany attempted in early 1917 to float an idea with the Mexican government for an alliance against the U.S. in case of a war between the U.S. and Germany, the secret telegram describing the proposal was intercepted and deciphered by the British government and made public for everyone in the U.S. to see. And Americans were outraged by this. Here you see a New York Times headline, Germany seeks an alliance against U.S., asks Japan and Mexico to join her. Full text of her proposal made public. And in my opinion, it was really quite a dumb move for Germany to make to even send this proposal, because even if the message had not been intercepted, Mexico would not have had much help to offer to Germany, nor do I think Japan was ready to change its mind either. Japan had already made up its mind to support Britain and France. Yeah, in Mexico, as far as it was concerned, it was in the middle of its own civil war at the time, and the Mexican government was having enough difficulty managing its own territory. An invasion of the United States was out of the question. Germany should have known that, and known that proposing this alliance was not even worth the slightest risk of this proposal being discovered. So a dumb move by Germany. And so with these new outrages, old grievances began to resurface, and Americans began revisiting some things that had happened earlier in the war that Americans had kind of blown off earlier and kind of, ignored. But now the accumulation of wrongs was just too much, and Americans began to see these other things that Germany had done in a new light. So what were these things? For example, one was Germany's general reputation for being obedient militarists, as suggested in this historical video of Germany's anthem at the time. You can watch this. It's kind of strange, how different past cultures have been, like here where they sing about to fight and bleed with joy for throne and empire. It's kind of a mentality that I find it difficult to really understand nowadays. But it's partly attitudes like this that earned the Germans their militaristic Hun reputation, for being these like militaristic, barbarians who just want to fight for the glory of their empire. It's that and the propaganda produced by the U.S. under the Committee on Public Information that portrayed the Germans as ape-like Huns. We'll get to that in a second. Another factor was Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium and its fairly severe occupation of Belgium that included executions of civilians who were suspected of aiding resistance against the German occupation. Some people refer to this as the rape of Belgium, at German hands. And then number 3 was Germany's sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which killed many American passengers. By the way, the Lusitania was also sending war supplies like guns and ammunition to Britain as well. So as far as Germany was concerned, it was fair game. It was a fair target. And Germany even posted advertisements in American newspapers saying, look, we believe this vessel is carrying military supplies. We are going to fire upon it if we encounter it. Do not board this ship. So Germany tried to give Americans fair warning, but American passengers went on it anyways. And at time, Americans had kind of griped and muttered. There was a bit of an outrage, but it wasn't enough single-handedly to send the U.S. to war against Germany. But then, of course, it's just one of these many different outrages that accumulated and helped make it easier to make the case against Germany finally in 1917. So the question then, once the U.S. did declare war on Germany, was how to organize the home front to fight Germany, how to overcome some of the disagreement among Americans over this war. How to rally everyone in support of this war effort, especially when Americans were not super united on it at first. Um, in fact, most Americans were persuaded by Woodrow Wilson's comments, by these sorts of posters that the government put out to portray the Germans as this uniquely evil Hun-like force that's coming to storm into your home. Which, was Germany really going to sail across the ocean and invade the U.S.? No. This is hyperbole. This is exaggeration. But it was effective at getting Americans on board with the war. Here's another one showing the Germans with their spiked helmet as this sort of ape-like creature out to basically capture our wives and abduct them and to beat us over the head with their German Kultur, their culture, this club. And then the helmet says militarism here. So another poster vilifying the Germans as subhumans. But for those who are still unwilling to support the war effort, after all the arguments made and all the pro-war propaganda, Congress also passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts in 1917 and 1918 to make efforts to obstruct the war illegal and to allow the federal government to investigate Americans' mail in order to uncover propaganda that aimed to obstruct the war effort. And this obstruction was interpreted very loosely and included things like criticizing the draft, the government, the Constitution, or even disrespecting the flag. Those were all illegal. And in fact, when the Espionage Act was challenged in the Supreme Court as infringing on Americans' First Amendment rights to freedom of speech in the Schenck versus U.S. case, the Supreme Court upheld the Espionage Act, arguing that the First Amendment does not guarantee the ability of Americans to say things that would endanger other Americans in the sort of emergency situation that was then facing the country, much like how we need not tolerate someone yelling fire in a crowded theater, causing a stampede that kills people needlessly. They said, look, wartime is an emergency situation. We need to constrain the right to freedom of speech, in this circumstance. These pieces of legislation also set up the Bureau of Investigation, which would later on become the FBI. This agency ended up arresting, jailing, and or deporting some socialists who opposed America's involvement in World War I. For example, socialist presidential candidate Eugene Debs was sent to prison for speaking against conscription during World War I, and anarchist Emma Goldman was deported to Russia. Pro-war Americans also occasionally took matters into their own hands to bully and silence anti-war Americans. The American Protective League and the American Legion were particularly active in dispensing vigilante punishments on anti-war Americans and or striking workers who threatened to hold up production for the war. And by punishments, I just mean bullying, heckling, beating people up, chasing anti-war agitators out of town, that sort of thing. In a way, I don't know, to me, this kind of all seems a little bit reminiscent of what I might call fascism light. All right, not full-blown fascism, but diet fascism in a way, because one notable feature of World War I was the extent to which the American federal government sought to control prices, production, and the rationing of consumer goods during World War I for the sake of the war effort. All right, and this is kind of similar to fascism. The state intervening to rally the country behind support for a war effort. Telling business, telling labor, telling everyone to get behind the war effort, get behind the national cause. And by the way, I always find it somewhat astonishing that central planning, a much criticized concept during peacetime, suddenly becomes very fashionable whenever America embarks on a major war. And suddenly free market economics flies out the window and is ignored, only to be brought back and celebrated after the war. And my question is always, if free market economics works so great, why not entrust wartime production to that system when the stakes for the nation are truly high? Why you would especially want the economy to benefit from an efficient system, during wartime. So why not have it then? It's something I'm always baffled by, and I've never found a really satisfactory answer to. The American federal government also made sure to discourage and stifle class conflicts between business and workers during World War I. In one way, this was just a continuation of the progressive era trend of encouraging business and labor to compromise for the sake of the nation's prosperity. However, the enforcement of this process became much more strict during World War I. Striking workers could be drafted to fight in the armed forces or arrested under the Sedition Acts if their actions seemed to be obstructing the war effort. On the other hand, businesses faced more pressure to compromise and recognize moderate unions with moderate demands, but of course not radical unions with radical demands. When it came to groups like the industrial workers of the world, business and government worked hand in hand to raid their offices, arrest their leaders, and break up their organization. So in a way, this principle of using substantial state power to vigorously enforce a class peace between business and labor for the sake of the nation's strength is one of the defining features of fascism, especially as practiced in Italy after World War I. The difference between the US during World War I and Italy under fascism was that Italy's government used harsher and more comprehensive methods, such as a one-party state, more severe restrictions on freedom of speech, and so on, to make sure that the Italian nation was united and not split by internal class conflicts and other controversies. In other words, Italy pursued a similar goal, but with more ruthlessness and gusto, and with less concern for individual liberties. But with a little more wartime hysteria about foreign adversaries and internal socialist enemies, the U.S. during World War I might have started to travel farther down that road. It's sort of different points on a spectrum, I would argue. And I predict that the U.S. will face a strong temptation to go further in that direction, again, if the U.S. should happen to find itself in a serious war at any time in our lifetimes. It'll be something to keep an eye on. There's always the temptation to travel in a little bit more of a fascist direction, to not tolerate disagreements, to want to crack down on people who disagree with the war effort, to have the state have more power to do that, to crack down on internal enemies, to rile people up against external enemies in sort of nationalistic fervor. That's kind of textbook fascism right there. And there's a tendency to travel towards that in times of war. Now, there was a lot of appreciation of people who stepped up to sacrifice for the war effort. Both women and African Americans stepped up big time to support the war effort. For example, African Americans migrated from the South to northern industrial cities to fill in for white service members away in the military. And hundreds of thousands of African Americans also served in the military itself, albeit in segregated units. And women made similar sacrifices. Yet women won the right to vote after the war with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, while many blacks in the South still did not have a practical ability to vote after the war, thanks to voter intimidation and contrived legal obstacles. Many blacks complained that they experienced better treatment by Allied French soldiers than by fellow Americans, by white Americans. When white service members returned home to America, they expected to be able to take up their old jobs. Many found that women and African Americans had, in the meantime, taken up those jobs. Many women stepped aside and returned to clerical work or work as housewives and mothers, but these options were not really open to African American men, so many black men attempted to stay put in those jobs. Tension grew in many cities as African Americans and whites increasingly felt like they competed over jobs and public accommodations. This might sound harsh, but imagine you're a white service member, you go off to war, risk your life for your country, and then you come back to the home front after the war and find that you can't get a job. And look who's taken your previous job that you used to have. Oh, it's a African American. It was very easy to drum up hostility, over this sort of issue. Um, and for example, in Chicago, in one instance, a few blacks happened to stumble onto a white-only beach on Lake Michigan, which sparked citywide race riots. And other race riots occurred in Tulsa, East St. Louis, and other cities across the U.S. Um, so there's all this tension, on the home front still, especially across racial lines. These racial conflicts after the war spurred on both the NAACP and its hope of integration and equality, and black nationalists like Marcus Garvey, who felt like it was time to give up on white America and move back to Africa. So while we think of World War I as a time of prosperity and unity in America, this was not always the case. But surely these bumps in the road were worth it to defeat Imperial Germany and make the world safe for democracy, right? Surely this was going to be the war to end all wars, right? Unfortunately, Britain and France were having none of it. They had done about 10 times the amount of fighting and dying in World War I compared to America. And if you look at casualties, soldiers killed, for that reason, they had much more negotiating leverage. And they insisted on, number one, that Germany take formal responsibility for starting the war, and that Germany pay the Allies $33 billion in war reparations. Number two, that all of Germany's overseas colonies in Africa and the Pacific would be transferred to Britain and France, and by the way, not given independence and national self-determination, as Woodrow Wilson had promised for those colonies. Number three, that the region of Alsace-Lorraine would be given back to France from Germany. Reasonable. Number four, because this had been a province of France previously. Number four, that Germany would be forbidden to send troops into the Rhineland region on the border with France. And France would also obtain the right to occupy this region of Germany anytime France wished to do so. And number five, that Germany's military would be strictly limited to 100,000 soldiers, and its Navy and Air Force would be tightly restricted in size. So all of this was despite Woodrow Wilson's promise in his 14 points that he would try to get a more neutral peace agreement that was lenient to all sides, a peace that would guarantee national self-determination for former colonies, mutual arms reduction among all the major powers, not just Germany, and a League of Nations to solve disputes peacefully and prevent future wars. Technically, Wilson did obtain agreement to set up the League of Nations, but the U.S. Senate would not let the U.S. join, and this League of Nations was unable to prevent World War II. By the way, one reason for World War II was Germans felt stabbed in the back, as they put it, both by Woodrow Wilson and the other Allied leaders, who promised a lenient peace, but then gave them a harsh peace agreement. And they also felt stabbed in the back by the predominantly Jewish and socialist politicians who had negotiated this Treaty of Versailles, this peace treaty that was so hard on Germany. And Germans were eager for revenge against enemies both external and internal. Against the external enemies that had foisted this peace upon them, and against the internal enemies who had allegedly caved in and signed this peace agreement on Germany's behalf. The German generals and Kaiser Wilhelm II had seen by the last months of the war that the war was lost for Germany, and they had cleverly stepped aside during the revolution in Germany in November of 1918 to let others sort out the dirty business of signing a humiliating peace treaty. Then these generals and other right-wing leaders in Germany could turn around and falsely claim, look, Germany was still winning the war, but Jewish and socialist traitors gave it all away. We could have signed a better peace treaty. By the way, no, they couldn't have not. Germany was on the last ropes. It was on the verge of complete and utter defeat, when it signed the ceasefire and started negotiations. But these right-wing leaders said, next time, we'll make sure that these internal enemies aren't in a position to sabotage our war effort. And here are the origins of the rise of Nazism, the imprisoning of socialists, communists, and Jews, and the systematic extermination of Jews in the Holocaust. That's where a lot of this comes from, is this perception that Jews stabbed Germany in the back at the end of World War One. It's completely false perception, in my opinion, but that's where a lot of Germans were coming from. So I look forward to your debates in the discussion forums this week over whether the U.S. should or should not have gotten involved in World War One, and I will see you there.